Good afternoon, everyone. Can we give a warm welcome to Tasmina and Salmond? Good afternoon. Firstly, thank you to everyone for coming along today. It's brilliant to see another packed out room discussing the updated case for Scottish independence. Can I just start by paying my respects to the families and friends of all those involved in the tragic events that shook our island and Lochash 2 weeks ago. Some will be aware that the funeral of John McKinnon is taking place this afternoon, and I'm sure all our thoughts will be with his family and not least his children in what will be a very difficult day for them all. So I'll introduce our former MP and chair of the Alba party and chair for today's meeting, Tasmina Ahmed Shah.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Hector. Good morning, and thank you very much for your warm welcome and for turning out this morning to hear from us. We've been taking the wee Alba book across Scotland and now to the islands, and what we found, I'm just going to stand up actually if you don't mind, I can see you much better at the back that way. What we found when we launched the wee Alba book in March of this year, 2022, we've been taking it round the country, and I think across Scotland and the islands, and I think this is possibly our 35th or 36th event. Denise will keep me right. The most energising thing I found about it is it's reminded me of the time we had in that great summer of 2014 when I had the privilege of being on the board of Yes Scotland and being hands-on in the campaign for Indy Ref 1 for Scottish independence, and just seeing people in village halls and city centre venues across Scotland asking really interesting questions about the future of Scotland, and we're very excited that we hopefully will have the opportunity to put that question to the touch next year in the referendum promised of the 19th of October 2023. But this meeting is an opportunity for us to speak to you about the updated case for independence contained within the wee Alba book. This publication has been put together not actually just by the Alba Party at all, but by people across the movement who've contributed either in terms of writing the book itself or in terms of the interviews that you'll find if you scan the codes that are in the book. It contains interviews that take you to people with various expertise in the different topics that we cover. The purpose of today is for you to receive a copy of the book, and if you've had one already and had a chance to read and digest it, to ask questions of our experienced panel about it, and any questions you might have indeed about an independent Scotland. So without further ado, I am quite a strict chair, so I'm going to be asking our speakers to give sort of 5 or 10 minutes introduction, some opening remarks from them. We'll start with Dave, and then Eva, then Hector, and then we'll finish with Alex. And then I'm going to throw open questions to your good selves. There's an opportunity, I think, perhaps to write down questions. Otherwise, we're happy to take any questions. Feel free, I'll call you just to stand up and ask your questions. Without further ado, can I take this opportunity, and it's been a long time since we've met, Dave, and it's lovely to see you looking grand, to introduce former members of Parliament, much better than being members of Parliament, isn't it, Dave? It's a much better life afterwards. To introduce Dave Thompson. Welcome, Dave.
Well, thanks very much, Tasmina, and it's really great to be here with you today. You're looking grand yourself too. It's brilliant to be here in Feskerma, Harsden. I remember back in 2014 in this very room, I think it was, during the campaign, being up here on this table and arguing the case, and all over the constituency, which is Skyloch, Aber and Badenoch, which stretches all the way, of course, to the Black Isle, Cromarty, and then Aviemore and down to Lochaber as well, and Glencoe and so on. A massive constituency, but a beautiful and brilliant constituency. And we had some great debates in 2014. And I don't recollect one of these where there was any trouble or any bother. Never saw an egg during the whole campaign. It was brilliant. I particularly liked the one with me and Ian Blackford, and we took on the Guy Morrison, who'd been the MSP for the Western Isles, and Charles Kennedy. It was down in Dorney, actually, and we wiped the floor with them. They had no real arguments, and that hall in Dorney was jam-packed full of people, which was just wonderful. And I'm really looking forward to getting involved in the campaign over the next 18 months or so to October next year. Now, I was the MSP, well, first of all for the Highlands and Islands from 2007 till 11, and then for Skylochaber and Badenoch from 11 till 16, when I decided to stand down. But that didn't end my involvement in campaigning for independence. In fact, I've been campaigning for independence since 1965, when I joined the SNP in Elgin as a 16-year-old. And then I was a founder member of the Lossiemouth branch. The following year, Arthur Donaldson had come up and he spoke in the drill hall, and there was quite a number of folk there, and we formed the Lossie branch of the SNP at that time. So I've been campaigning ever since. I thought we were actually going to win independence in 1970, but I was disillusioned because we didn't even get Gordon Campbell out at that time. Now, since I stood down as an MSP, I've been involved with the Scottish Independence Convention. I was vice chair for a while, and at the time when we set up Voices for Scotland, which is a limited company, properly constituted, and I was the first chair of the board for Voices for Scotland. And the whole purpose of Voices was to woo the soft nose, to get them over to the yes side. It was launched, but unfortunately, the day before we launched Voices, the SNP launched, and I was still a member of the SNP at that time, Yes.Scot, and launched their fundraiser, and we were doing ours the following day. I was slightly peeved at that, I have to say, because I had kept Keith Brown, who was deputy leader at that time, I think he might still be, I'm not sure, fully informed of what the Indie Convention was actually doing and everything about Voices. We weren't told a peep about the launch of Yes.Scot, the Rainbow Yes, I think they call it now. And it was really disappointing because it did pull the rug from under the Indie Convention Voices, which was a shame, because I've always believed there's only one way we're going to get independence, and that is if we all come together. We've got to have unity. And if we don't have unity, our opponents will tear us apart. And that's the biggest danger for us. I got involved about 2.5 years ago with a group of people, and we set up a political party eventually it was called Action for Independence, AFI. First name we chose was Alliance for Independence. And when we went to register with the Electoral Commission, they wouldn't let us use the word alliance. And their argument was, if it was an alliance, it would have to include all of the parties in favour of independence. Now, that's patent nonsense as far as I'm concerned. The trouble was, they dragged this out for ages. They kept us hanging on, quite deliberately, I'm pretty certain. Their board is made up, or it certainly has people on it, from the different other political parties, and no doubt they were putting their views over. So we really struggled to get Alliance for Independence set up, because we then had to go back and change the name. So we changed it to Action for Independence, AFI, because we wanted it top of the list when it came to the next Scottish election in 2021. So we really have to watch the Electoral Commission. If there's any kind of thought of a formal alliance at the next general election, UK election, that needs to be started now to get through the processes. So my recommendation would be, don't actually go down the road of formal alliances trying to create an umbrella party, which is what AFI was to be, pulling other parties in under our umbrella. Just try to get agreement between the existing parties not to stand against each other in certain seats, so that the seats are divvied up and there's one independent supporting candidate in each seat, and it's fairly sort of allocated across Scotland. Now that wouldn't be an easy negotiation, I'm sure, but that's the way I think we would have to do it. If we try to do a formal thing, we'll come across the same problems that we came across. AFI was actually all set to go for the 2021 election. We had 42 candidates in place, and then a certain Mr. Alex Salmond and the Alba party appeared. And we had a meeting pretty shortly after that announcement, and it was unanimous, well, near enough unanimous, out of our executive, which had about 20-odd people from all over Scotland, that we would stand down as a political party and support Alba and stand aside, because we took the view that Alba would have a better chance of winning on the lists without AFI competing against Alba. And our whole mantra was marks the yes vote on the list. So we didn't want to be standing, which would divide the yes vote. So nearly all of our people, I think, joined Alba and are still involved in Alba. Unfortunately, Alba didn't do as well as we'd all hoped. But I think that goes right down to the basic fact that the SNP decided to do the both votes SNP thing. And there's a certain sense to that, I suppose, in a Scottish election on the list. The trouble is, they got 2 extra seats for that, for 1 million votes. If AFI had been successfully, if we'd actually successfully stood and pulled people together, or if Alba had been given more of a positive run, we could have got 15 or 20 of those regional list seats, and there would be 15 or 20 or maybe even 25 unionist MSPs not in the Scottish Parliament right now, so not able to stand in front of rubbish bins in Edinburgh pointing the finger at the Scottish Government. Similarly, when I was involved with Inver-Yes, and I still am, we put a motion to the Indy Convention for the council elections. Unity for Yes is what we called it, and we got the SIC to agree to write to all the political parties in favour of independence to ask them would they support a united front, basically telling people on the Scottish elections, which is a PR system, vote till you boke, vote for all independence candidates. Take your first one up there, and if it's SNP, fine, make it first. If it's SNP 2, fine. But then look at the other independent supporting parties after that. And we'll get more independent supporting councillors into the various councils. The SNP wouldn't play ball. And I'm not here to criticise the SNP. I love the SNP. I was a founder member of the Lossiemouth branch of the SNP. I want the SNP to succeed for Scotland. I'm not too bothered if the SNP succeed just for the sake of the SNP. And that's my worry about where things have been going in recent years. So in some areas, the SNP actually used the both votes SNP in the council elections. Now that's intellectually crazy, because with a PR system, you don't need to just vote twice. You can vote as many times as you want, and your top preferences will always get the greatest benefit. And once they've been allocated, it's only once they are out of the equation in the calculations that the ones further down come into play. But we could have got a lot more councillors, independent supporting councillors across Scotland from other parties, into councils if we had followed that line. A number of parties, including Alba, actually agreed to follow that line at the council election. So it does worry me that there's this attitude in the SNP that seems to be thinking more of the SNP at times than it does for Scotland. Anyway, that's a wee kind of potted history of me and what I feel about different things. I've probably gone over my 5 minutes, over my 10 minutes, I think. So Tasmina was a way to prod me there, but to save myself getting prodded, I'll just thank you all very much for listening, and I'll sit down.
Thank you very much indeed, Dave, and indeed for setting the scene of today's meeting. I think it's a good opportunity because you've mentioned a lot of groups within your opening remarks, and I think it's really important to get on record that this movement is in good heart. One of the main reasons is because of the work of all of the Yes groups across Scotland, which have continued to campaign for independence when it could be argued some people charged with that responsibility have been asleep at the wheel. So it's a good opportunity to say that, and also brings me the opportunity to say thank you to Independence Live, who are here today and streaming this event, and we'll look direct into the camera and say thank you, because you have been working constantly right up to 2014 and beyond, filming every single event that you can get to. And without you, there wouldn't be a window for the movement to see what's happening across the country. So thank you very much indeed, and more power to you. On that note, in terms of power to people and people who campaign relentlessly, it's really a privilege for me to invite Eva to speak. Now, Eva, I've known for a number of years, and at least when she campaigned for me in 2015 when I won in South Perthshire election for the SNP, and there she was with Matt side by side campaigning all around the constituency, and she's never stopped campaigning. I find not just a great camaraderie with Eva because she's an amazing woman, and women matter in this campaign. Women matter in Scotland. Being a woman is important, but because she believes what she says. And I think if you want to get people to believe in you and believe what you're saying is correct and believe that you're making sense when you think that Scotland should be independent, you have to be honest in your presentation of those arguments and be passionate with them. And Eva encapsulates that in everything that she says. So don't let me down in what you're going to say after that introduction. Please join me in welcoming Eva Comrie.
Thank you very much, and I'm pleased to say that Dave's membership of the SNP is only a couple of years older than mine, because I was campaigning for the SNP in the late 1960s. At that time, and you'll probably understand from what I'm about to tell you why the word equality means so much to me. At that time, I lived with my mum and my dad and my two wee brothers in a caravan on a site in Crieff, and one of my brothers was still in a pushchair, a wee comfy folder, and my mum used to stick the SNP leaflets and the Scots Independence newspaper in the bottom of the pushchair and trail us all round the big posh houses in Crieff, up and down the drives, flinging the newspapers up the drives and firing the leaflets in the letterboxes. And sometimes when you're 6 and 7 year old, you don't understand what the hell it is that your mother's on now, what's her latest crusade. And then you have a new year when you're hiding behind a couch in the living room of your caravan, and your mum and dad have got the radiogram on and all their pals are in and there's Sweetheart Stouts and Baby Shams flowing. And the singing starts and they're singing Flower of Scotland and they're all in tears. You're thinking, what is going on here? And the years go by, and then you find yourself in 1971. Still living in your caravan, but your dad's worked hard and saved up, and you've got a fortnight's holiday in a dormobile, and you're going round the north of Scotland on the single track, passing place roads, and you're having the time of your life. Sometimes we ran out of petrol and we had to freewheel up and down parts of probably Ross, Cromarty, Harbour, you name it. Went right round the coast, went up to John O'Groats of all places. Fascinating experience, saw the first and last house in Scotland, drove right along the top, down the side, stopped at Achiltebue, saw shooting stars, and then got to Mallaig and the ferries. And unfortunately, so many people were determined to come to Skye that year that there was a queue. And ferries came and ferries went, and we were still sitting in the queue. And all the mums and dads in the queues beside us were out buying sweeties and cones and packets of crisps for all the kids that were fed up sitting waiting for this damn ferry. And nightfall came and a piper appeared. And it was one of the most poignant memories of my life. I would have been probably about 8 and a half. And this piper stood and piped as the sun came down and darkness fell, and there would not have been a dry eye. But I couldn't understand why all these adults were greeting. But they were greeting for all the songs and all the poignancy and the memories and the hopes, the dreams, the shattered hopes of some and the future hopes of others. And that encapsulated for me what Skye became for me, because the following morning the ferry was there. We'd all slept the night, probably all queuing up outside toilets, men arguing with each other because they'd run out of cigarettes, women trying to make pieces on jam for their hungry bairns. But the ferry arrived and we went over the sea to Skye, and I'll bet you every person on that ferry was singing that song with vigour, gusto and a determination that somehow something was going to have to change. I didn't understand it then, but I think I understand it now. We landed on the Misty Isle and you saw the most beautiful sights, the Cool and the Old Man of Storr. I don't have to tell any of you, you know why you live here. You love it, it's in your very bones, it's in your very soul. And people like me that came from a caravan and landed in a place like this thought we had landed really in a special form of paradise, because that's exactly what it is. And that's what I thought it was when I was that wee lassie. But I learned over time that sometimes the greatest of scenery and the greatest of motivations can hide the hardest of pain and hardships. And so it was with eventually a very heavy heart that I realised that places like Skye or the Outer Isles, or, you know, to an extent Orkney, or whether you go to Arran or any of the islands of this great country, all suffer hardships and unnecessary want and poverty of all different sorts. So we know that there is obviously a long-standing issue in relation to the land. There's very long-standing, deep-rooted issues in relation to health provision, and we know that there are concerns shared here as they are across the whole of Scotland and further afield in relation to fuel poverty, what we call the cost of living crisis, and poverty generally. And for me, I now understand, as I have understood for the last 30 years, what it was that my mum was doing on her escapades in the 1960s, and why it was that in 1972 and 1974 and all the elections after that, she and my dad and all their pals, and then folk like me as we grew up and we grew older, were punching the air every time an SNP MP was elected, and then SNP MSPs were elected, and then we had a government that was SNP, and then we had a majority government, and we had a referendum. And the hopes and the dreams of everybody that I ever met in my life who wanted Scottish independence were encapsulated the night before the referendum when we stood in George Square. I was there with thousands and thousands of people, and we were absolutely convinced that the following day this country was going to vote yes. And we weren't voting yes for ourselves in the main. We were voting yes for our children and their children's children, so that they would grow up in the country that we know Scotland ought to be. And the reason that Scotland is not flourishing is a lack of political will, and nowadays a lack of, or an absolute act of political cowardice on the part of the people that should be bringing this country together. So my view today, of all days, but particularly today on Skye, is this. As Dave said, Scotland requires unity like never before. We know what's coming ahead of us in relation to the fuel crisis. We know that people will suffer, people will hunger, people will die unnecessarily if these issues are not addressed radically and immediately. Ours is an energy-rich nation. We are a net exporter of energy. Under no circumstances should any person in Scotland of whatever nature or background be suffering from hunger, poverty, want or cold. Nobody in this country should be afraid to turn on the electricity, and the fact that they are is testament to how very wrong this country has gone. So I would wish that everybody in Scotland would put their shoulder to the wheel and deliver for Scotland independence, not for the here and now, but for what we can make this country be, the country it's supposed to be, a land of potential and a land of plenty for all of Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Eva. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Hector Macleod and also thank him for his arrangements, bringing us all together, and for making the wise and very excellent decision of postponing it when it was first publicised as having taken place. So, of course, all of our thoughts and wishes with those at the funeral today. But Hector, of course, has come to our conferences. Our National Council makes a big journey down from here. But what I find really important, which is what I mentioned to him just when we were in the car park coming in, is the period of time I've been here, maybe sort of 24 hours or so, I've met with a lot of people who've spoken to me about the very issues that Hector brings to conference. Housing, not least, being one of them on the Isle of Skye. So it just goes to show it's all very well when you see things in writing brought to you in a motion form in a conference, when you debate what we can do as a political party to raise issues and deliver on some of the things that are being brought forward by Hector and others, but actually to realise the practical ramifications of the situations in which you find yourselves in, and I find that really instructive. So I'm so grateful for the invitation actually to be here to give me an insight into that, but also, of course, to introduce you, Hector. And, you know, over the past day, we've met with a lot of people, and, of course, a lot of people know everyone, and no one's had a bad word to say about you yet, Hector, so you're doing well. Hector Macleod.
Thanks, Saz. I think it's quite significant that this roadshow on the Wee Alba book, which I believe will play an important role in our final journey towards independence, has come to Skye. Skye, of course, was a yes island in 2014, and I've no doubt will be again on October 19th next year. Skye and its people have played a major part in changing the course of some of Scotland's history, with two notable occasions being the Battle of the Braes during the clearances 140 years ago this past April, and more recently in 1995 we had the Battle of the Skye Bridge, where again the people of Skye rose up and fought against the ludicrous bridge tolls that eventually led to all bridge tolls being removed in Scotland. So although Skye is facing what I believe to be a second clearance with a disastrous housing crisis, which Westminster, Holyrood and Highland Council need to be held accountable for, but I'll not carry on in that or we will be here all night. I believe the people of Skye, those that are lucky enough still to stay on the island, can have a role to play in the independence movement, but also that the movement can learn a thing or two from the resilience of the Skye people. Maybe not so much from the Battle of Braes, as we've moved on from any violence being required, and we pride this movement on being a peaceful movement. But we can certainly learn from the tactics that the SCAT group deployed in the fight against the tolls. I was obviously not old enough to join in that campaign. Although my parents informed me I was a wee rebel growing up, 5 to 7 years old was just a bit young to get involved. But, and please forgive me for promoting a programme by the BBC, but if you get a chance, the Battle of the Skye Bridge on iPlayer is well worth a watch to see some of the peaceful civil disobedience displayed in that 2-year campaign. So moving on to the reason we're all here, independence. And some of you might be wondering why I'm up here, and I questioned it myself when Denise suggested it. I thought to myself, why should I be on the panel? What credentials do I have? Yes, I stood in the council elections, but unlike Murdo Fraser, I'll accept I didn't get enough votes to be elected. But then I thought, and I'll be honest here, I was looking for reasons to convince myself, as being on a panel with Alex, who I've admired and respected since becoming interested in politics, was a once in a generation. No, I'll not say it. It was a chance I might not get again. So the reason I convinced myself with was basically, why shouldn't I, or why shouldn't any of yous be on the panel? Something we've maybe been guilty of, and certain politicians as well as some independence groups have definitely been guilty of, is forgetting that this independence movement doesn't belong to politicians or any organised groups. It belongs to us, the people of Scotland, old Scots as well as new Scots. As Alex put it so eloquently in that speech after the referendum in 2014, and hope he doesn't mind me borrowing this quote, but he said, The real guardians of progress are no longer politicians at Westminster or Holyrood, but the energised activism of tens of thousands who he predicted would refuse to meekly go back into the political shadows. And he was right. If we look at where we find ourselves now, I think it's fast becoming clear that if we're going to regain our independence, we're going to need that energised activism of the tens of thousands that we've seen in 2014 to get back out onto the streets and show both governments in Westminster as well as Holyrood that we are the sovereign people of Scotland and we're not asking permission for our voices to be heard, we're demanding it. Our opponents will tell us and keep telling us, you've had your referendum, it was once in a generation, you voted no, deal with it. We should be replying, yes, we had a referendum, yes, once in a generation phrase was used, but it was just that, a phrase, never a policy, just as the current UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, described the 2019 election as a critical once-in-a-generation election. But if they want to use the generation argument, they should take a look at the Good Friday Agreement, where the UK government's own definition of a political generation is 7 years, and we're now nearly 8 years on. And finally, yes, we lost the 2014 referendum, but we lost it on the basis of what now have been proven lies. We went ahead in the polls and were looking strong in the lead-up to the referendum, and then Gordon Brown devised the vow that the three stooges of the Union, Cameron, Clegg and Miliband, signed up to, and the Daily Record plastered on its front pages. Now, when most people think of vows, they think of wedding vows, so let's look at it in comparison. And I need to be careful here, because my fiancée Alex is in the audience. So Cameron, Clegg and Miliband stood at the altar and said their vows to Scotland. They were going to love and cherish us forever. We shouldn't leave, we should lead, and they would treat us as equal partners. Of course, between then and now, we know most, if not all, these vows have been broken. We've had English votes for English laws, we've had the power grab, we've had the complete lack of respect afforded to Scottish MPs, including most recently when Alba MPs Kenny McCaskill and Neil Hamvey were not just thrown out of Parliament, but nearly caused the Speaker to turn purple in fury that a Scottish MP should actually grow a set of lungs and stand up to the Westminster charade and demand that Scotland's voice was heard. And of course we've had Brexit, voted for by the people of England and Wales, but importantly voted against by the people of Scotland and Northern Ireland. So breaking all these vows would surely guarantee a divorce in any voluntary union. But how do we get this divorce if our partner wouldn't even listen to us, let alone have discussions with us? Well, I'm sure Alex will be speaking more on strategies and tactics on how, but one thing I would say is, whatever the strategy or route, whether it be the referendum next October, a plebiscite at the next general election, an independence convention, or the Salvo Claim a Right movement, which I'd encourage anyone who's not heard of it to visit salvo.scot when you go home and sign up to the movement for free. But whatever the route, one thing is for sure, we need the people with us, and that means we independent supporters must get back out on the streets. And I'm going to give Carol Ingalls of Yes Skye and Lochalsh a mention here, as I know she is doing a massive amount of work for Yes Skye and Lochalsh, but I also know it's getting harder to get motivated due to lack of member supporter participation. So please watch out or sign up for the Yes Skye and Lochalsh emails informing you with what's happening and get involved. Don't think it's somebody else's job, it's all of our jobs to support people like Carol who haven't stopped since 2014, but also to support the movement and to support the cause. A few things we know are happening which you can support now is the fortnightly street stalls in Portree Square, the weekly Skye Bridge Walk for Independence every Sunday at 10 AM with Callum MacDonald, and the exciting news that 1 year from now, all under one Skye and Lochalsh will be hosting its first all under one banner march. And if you can and are able to, I would really encourage as many of us to attend the Estival rally in Freedom Square, also known to some as George Square in Glasgow, on 18th September to mark 8 years since the 14 referendum. So there is plenty to get involved in. I'm going to finish up now, and I promise I'm shutting up soon, by saying a few words about our special guest today, former First Minister and current Alba Party leader, the Right Honourable Alex Salmond. As I mentioned earlier, Alex is someone I've admired and respected since I took an interest in politics. But even before I took an interest in politics, I was voting SNP because of Alex. And the reason for which I know was maybe a daft reason then to base my vote on, but at the time, it was after seeing a picture of Alex with the Tartan Army at the '98 World Cup in France. But it wasn't the typical politician picture of saying they were there with the fans while sat in executive boxes or posh restaurants. It was Alex in, I believe, Bordeaux Square, in his Scotland top, a big Scotland hat on and a salter around him, really joining in with the Tartan Army, maybe even searching for an off-licence or a fountain. I love the fact a politician, a party leader, came across as just a normal Tartan Army member, passionately supporting their country. Then, of course, when I took an interest in politics in the run-up to the 2014 referendum, my opinion of Alex was confirmed. Watching and listening to him talk and debate about Scotland, you could see his passion and desire for his country. In fact, I think if you were to look inside Alex's heart, you would find a rampant lion riding a unicorn, draped in a saltire, drinking iron brew, chasing a Hebridean wild haggis. Such is his patriotism towards Scotland. So when I hear the ridiculous accusations that Alex has come back into politics to boost an ego or to be relevant again, I honestly despair. Apart from anything else, if you look at what this man has been put through over the last few years, the easiest and best option for him would have been to walk away. Alex isn't daft. In fact, to the contrary, he's probably one of the most intelligent politicians we have in Scotland. So he would have known how the media were going to act and the tripe that was going to come his way by returning to frontline politics. But I believe, and I'm sure he'll correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think Alex based his decision to return on what was best for him, but more on what was best for his lifelong ambition to see an independent Scotland. So I'm delighted to see him back, and I truly believe his return, the forming of Alba, and this wee Alba book will play an imperative part in Scotland regaining its independence.
Thank you very much indeed, Hector. In fact, you've stolen the majority of what we could use to introduce Alex. But what a wonderful speech. And you're absolutely right. This movement doesn't belong to anyone. Neither do you have to have been a politician or held office to be able to articulate a case as wonderfully as you have just done, with a lot of comic elements as well, which is very important. One of the points you mentioned was about Alex's involvement with people and caring about people and happy to be a person of the people. And it brought back, when we were going to come a couple of weeks ago, Alex received an email from the Chair of Trustees at the Glenacoolish Preservation Trust, and she helps run the Glenalg Skye Ferry, who said, "You're not going to come up to Skye without coming to see us, are you, Alex?" And that's because when Alex was First Minister, he helped save that ferry with money from the First Minister's charity, as he always does. So he insisted that come what may, whenever we were going to regroup again in Skye, that we'd go via that ferry, which is what we did yesterday. A man true to his word, and they were delighted to see him. You see, in life, I believe these small things really matter to people. Caring about small communities and what it means for them to have a visit from someone well known really, really matters. And of course, they were delighted that he spent an absolute fortune in their shop buying all of their goods. So it's testament to what you had said in your speech about Alex as a person. Now, I've been at, with Denise, about 35 of these meetings now that Alex has been speaking at. And every time I think I've heard what he's going to say, and I can predict what he's going to say next, he comes up with more gems along the way. And that's what comes with having a brilliant strategic mind, infinite wisdom, just being really smart, and ensuring when we had our opportunities, we know, to have our referendum, we did it with one mandate and didn't wait for more than that. Now, I've known Alex for 21 years, and he's loved by all of my family. And I'd just like to repeat indeed what you have said, Hector, a man more committed to his country I have never met. And it's with a privilege I introduce him, Alex Salmond.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. We did come over yesterday at the Glenelg Ferry, and if anybody wants a Glenelg Ferry beanie, speak to me after the meeting. I also should say that in terms of my local bona fides, I'm also Vice President of the Isle of Skye Golf Club. sponsor there. So that's because I played in the medal back in 2013. We turned off on the Saturday morning, and it was what we'd call in the East Coast a har, and obviously you'd call sky mist. And it was, but you could see about 2 feet in front of you. It was a great leveller, the playing conditions, excellent. And strangely enough, I never lost a ball. Because, well, partly because I don't hit it that far, but also partly because I had 2 free packets of First Minister's golf balls with a salter on them. And strangely enough, I was the only one that never lost a ball all day. And I did really well in the medal, and they made me a vice president. So if you just want to call me vice president for the rest of the meeting, that'd be excellent. Hector, incidentally, it wasn't Bordeaux. I managed to get all the negatives of the Bordeaux pictures. It was Saint-Étienne, that picture you were talking about. I didn't get all of them, but I got all the Bordeaux ones, and they're safely out of sight, if no, quite out of mind. And I'm going to try and stick to my time, basically because the chair has bought a sheep prodder over at Glenelg, and it's when the electric bit at the end. So you were very wise, Dave, to sit down when you did. Otherwise, you'd have got more than you bargained for. But I'm getting extra time, and I'm getting extra time because of Jimmy from Bo'ness who wrote to me last week. Now, Jimmy was watching our last domestic Alba book meeting at the Edinburgh Festival a couple of weeks back. And I was telling a story about a boy from Bo'ness. And strangely enough, and probably for the first time in history, Independence Live had a small interruption in their transmission just when I was getting to the punchline about the story from the boy from Bo'ness. And Jimmy from Bo'ness, who wrote to me, missed the punchline, and he demanded that I tell the story again, and you're about to hear it. Actually, I don't think it was Independence Live's fault at all. Just that in Bo'ness, when you're using your neighbour's Wi-Fi, that sometimes happens, But anyway, the story about the boy from Bo'ness is this. He was on my granny's favourite television show, Take Your Pick. Now, Take Your Pick was one of the first game shows on television. This is long before the days of Des O'Connor. I mean, we're talking Michael Miles. And Michael Miles was one of the first game show hosts ever on television. And it was the most popular game show. And Michael Miles was a statuesque New Zealand received pronunciation host of the game show. And he'd made his early career in the war, doing wartime broadcasts, and he spoke absolutely perfect English. It was nothing like Huey Green. And my granny loved Michael Miles. She adored Michael Miles, and every Friday night she sat me watching Take Your Pick. And I wasn't real interested in Take Your Pick, but one night a boy from Bo'ness was on it. And that really interests me because I'm from Linlithgow, I'm from Livkey, just beside Bo'ness. It's, up the hill a bit, and, it's obviously a better class of place, but I mean, it's quite near Bo'ness. And so I was interested in the boy from Bo'ness and Take Your Pick. Now, you remember Take Your Pick. What happened is Michael Miles, or the host, has to bribe you during the programme. And his job is to make you open the box, or not open the box, where you could get the star prize. His job is to get you to take the money. Because if you open the box, you could get the yacht, or these days it was usually a mini, but you might end up with a carrot or a vegetable. So that is the excitement of the show. They don't make them like that anymore, do they? It's fantastic. Anyway, the boy from Bo'ness wins Take Your Pick. And it's Michael Miles' job is to get him not to open the box. So he says to the boy, he says, £50. I'll give you £50 not to open the box. Wee boy from Bo'ness says, listen, Mr. Miles, if I was lucky enough to win your great show, your fantastic show. I've told everybody in Bo'ness that I'm opening the box. I'm going for the yacht. I'm going to sail it up Bo'ness Harbour towards the 2 Forth bridges, which were there at the time. I'm going to say it. I'm going for open the box. Michael Miles says, £100. Boy from said, no. He says, look, tell my family, before I came out, if I was lucky enough to win your great show, Mr. Miles, I'm definitely opening the box. I'm going for the star prize. Michael Miles says, £500. Now, that was a fortune. We're talking the 1963. I know it was 1963 because my granny was very annoyed one day when they interrupted Take Your Pick to announce JFK's assassination in Dallas. She thought it was an outrage. I mean, she didn't like the assassination, but she thought it was an outrage they interrupted Take Your Pick. So 1963, £500 is a hell of a lot of money. I mean, it's still a lot of money. But you mean £500 now, you could put a down payment on your electricity bill, pay for a night's hotel in Skye, you know, it was a lot of money. But then it was a fortune, absolute fortune, £500, said Michael Miles. The boy from Bodess says, listen, he says, I'm telling you the truth now, he says, I promised my widowed mother, before I came out, I promised my widowed mother that if I was lucky enough to win your great show, Mr. Miles, I'm opening the box. I'm going for the Star Prize for the honour of Boness. You could offer me £1,000. I'm still opening the box. Michael Miles says, £1,000. Boy from Boness says, I'll take the money. Now, I learned two things that night. I learned one, boys from Boness weren't daft. And secondly, I learned you should never ask a question unless you're absolutely sure of what the answer's going to be, or you believe the answer's going to be, which has stood me in reasonable stead in politics, at least till 2014, it stood me in great stead. But it's something we should remember right now as we look at the position that Scotland is in. Hector says he's looking forward to the referendum on October the 19th next year. I am. I've got it circled in my diary. There should be a referendum. There should have been one before now, incidentally, but there should be one certainly on October the 19th next year, as we've been promised, no ifs, no buts, etc., etc. And I think there could be one, because I think the Westminster government is on the point of crumbling. You know, we're in the circumstances of a revolution at the present moment. You know, people are looking at the £5,000, £6,000, £7,000 on their electricity and heating bills. It's extraordinary. I mean, you know, and incidentally, in terms of arguing the economics of independence, you know, forget GERS, forget this, forget the balance sheet, forget whatever you want. All you have to say to people is, look, we've got a nap hand, 5 fingers in your hand. We've got land. We've got water. Have you seen the pictures of Europe recently? Where the colours are? The brown goes right up to Yorkshire. I mean, a bit of Ireland and Scotland are the only green bits in the continent of Europe at the present moment. So we've got land, we've got water, we've got oil, we've got gas. We've got 5 times the gas that Scotland consumes. We say, well, the international price of gas has gone up because of the war in Europe. Therefore, the electricity bills are going up. Wait a minute. We've got 5 times what Scotland consumes in terms of gas. And we've got renewable energy coming out of our ears. Offshore renewables, wind power just now, costs £50 a megawatt hour. That's half of what the new nuclear is going to cost. And the nuclear costs, as they always do, are going up. The cost of offshore wind's going down. International gas at the present moment costs £300 per megawatt hour, 6 times. We could produce within, well, we already are self-sufficient in renewables. So you might ask yourself, anybody would ask, still watching this, we are self-sufficient in renewables, so why is our electricity in Scotland based on the international price of gas, even forgetting the fact that we've got 5 times as much gas as we consume? And you can reasonably argue to anyone that in a rule of thumb, an electricity bill in Scotland will be 1/6 of what they're about to charge, or try to charge people over the next few months. Which is why we can fulfill Eva's wish that no person in this country, this energy-rich country, should be enduring fuel poverty. And if you argue that and you put together with the most important resource of all, our people, and their intellect, their imagination, their talent, the economics of independence is won on that argument. You don't need a slide rule or a calculator or a computer. It's won. It's an argument that is won if it's presented properly against a crumbling Tory government and probably the most inept. I mean, I've some real numpkins as Prime Ministers. I really have. But the latest, I mean, Liz Truss, the incoming Prime Minister, I mean, she makes Boris Johnson look like a giant. And Johnson made Cameron look like a giant. It's ridiculous. Totally, utterly ridiculous, and the people know it. And the idea that crumbling edifice in Westminster could withstand a sustained campaign to demand Scotland's right to a referendum is ridiculous. There's a reason, Hector, the Speaker was having, I think it was yourself, who was pointing out about the Speaker having apoplexy. Was he going to, oh, it was you, Hector, I beg your pardon, Dave. Somebody apoplexy because they're under pressure, they're frightened. So when Kenny and Neil got up to voice the anger that people feel from Scotland's right to decide being denied, then the Speaker, no wonder he's about to have a heart attack because, my God, the natives are revolting. I mean, I've been in the House of Commons, for, what, 27 years? Well, more than that, 29 years almost. And, you know, speakers in my day, you know, when I got flung out from time to time, they were quite relaxed about it. Of course they were relaxed about it, you know. So, I like just do this thing and we'll be back to normal tomorrow. The Speaker of the House of Commons looked like it was the world revolution was descending on them because he knows the danger. They feel the danger. And of course, doing it one day doesn't rattle their cages for more than 24 hours. Let's say it was happening every day. Let's say all 50 or almost 50 independent supporting MPs made it impossible for Westminster to function on a daily basis until Scotland's right to decide her democratic future was conceded. What then? I mean, Liz Truss, she's going to come in as Prime Minister. There's going to be problems all over the place. Chaos is reigning. And she wouldn't be able to conduct the House of Commons. And don't tell me it can't be done. Of course it can be done. Charles Stewart Parnell did it 150 years ago. It can be done within the rule book, without the rule book, but it can be done if there's a determination, a willpower to do it. And if you match parliamentary intervention with popular agitation, peaceful, sustained popular agitation and diplomatic representation, I believe that Westminster would crumble and concede that referendum next year. But the campaign has to be led. It can't just be Kenny and Neil sticking their heads above the parapet. It has to be everybody together and led with the representatives of the people doing their job and leading from the front. Not saying, you know, I'm leader, I'll have to follow what they do. Or worse still, not do anything at all. I don't agree with the second phase of Nicola's strategy. This is about take your pick. You should never ask a question unless you know the answer. And you shouldn't go to the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom in Middlesex Guildhall, 2 minutes walk from the Palace of Westminster, and say, can you really help me out? It's not going to happen. I've read the Lord Advocate's opinion. Lord Advocate's an interesting title and position. You know, the Lord Advocate is meant to represent the government. It's the government's law officer. But she has another job, which is to administer fairly the judicial and legal system of Scotland, and in that there should be no political interference of any kind whatsoever, and it should be kept distant, perhaps, and indeed it should be two jobs, incidentally. But in terms of the government's legal advisor, she's meant to be our advocate, or the government's advocate. If you read her opinion at the Supreme Court, it's on the one hand this, or it's on one hand that. It's not an advocacy at all. She's not the Lord Judge, she's your advocate. And if you were deciding to go to the Supreme Court, you wouldn't go to ask their opinion. You would take the legislation through the Parliament, have it voted for with a democratic mandate of Scotland's representatives, allow it to be challenged. Much better position to say you've got a democratic mandate, because courts are sometimes leery about overturning a democratic vote. If you go along and say, what's your opinion? You'll probably get more than you answered for if you get an answer to that question at all. And finally, in the third leg of the strategy, the one that Dave alluded to, if you're going for a plebiscite election, then it has to be as a Scotland United. If you fight it as a normal election and you say, look, we're going for a majority of votes, you can win an overwhelming victory. I saw an opinion poll last week, was being heralded in the National, if the SNP are going to win 50 seats on 44% of the vote. That would be an enormous victory, astonishing victory, but in the lines of saying we have to have a majority of the vote, it would be treated as a defeat. So if you lost, even if you won, right, it'd be treated as a defeat. And if you won by some mischance, and it's never happened before, people say it happened in 1955, no it didn't. The Tories were in alliance in 1955 with the National Liberals. Dave remembers it very well. It was the first election he stood in. So it's never been done. No party has ever won a majority of the vote in Scotland. Even in the Anna Mirabilis of 2015, we were a fraction short of the majority of the vote in Scotland. You don't set up a condition that's impossible to leap forward. And a parliamentary election is decided in numbers of seats. And the best way to do it, the only way to do it, is to make sure you've got one candidate in each constituency. And of course, the Electoral Commission would be somewhat more obliging if it was a large party behind that. And it's been done before. It was done by Lord George in 1918 when he had a coup in election. So you stood under Tory, mostly, Liberal, Labour, but with the Lloyd George letter and coup in. And similarly, if you're doing a plebiscite election, you would have to have SNP, Scotland United, Alba, Scotland United, whatever, Green, Scotland United. Yes, the SNP would have the vast majority of the seats, but if you're genuine about saying that is the test, you'd have to be genuine about having one unified candidate carrying the independence banner in each seat. And then, and this is the point, it'll still take you back to the question of what you do once you've won. See, there is a mandate for a referendum. There's 4 mandates for a referendum by any judgment at the present moment. And the question is, what are you going to do about it to enforce it? If you win a mandate in a plebiscite election, the question would still be that. Because you don't seriously expect our unionist opponents to say, oh, well done, chaps, you've won. Let's set about negotiating. They're going to have to be politically, democratically, hand has to be forced, just as it has to be now. So some people say, how do you do it? Are we going to have an abstentionism like they did back in Ireland 100 years ago? You don't have to do that. Certainly you have to do something. I mean, you could, for example, if you so wish, set up shop in the Royal High School every Friday of the MPs and MSPs elected by the people of Scotland, making their declaration as the new estates of Scotland, a claim of right for Scottish sovereignty, because obviously the claim for independence doesn't actually lie in UK domestic law. It lies in independence law. It lies in international law. It lies in the United Nations Charter, the Helsinki Agreements. It lies in the Council of Europe in terms of freedom of expression, but is an inalienable right. But if that right is to be realised, it has to be led in that direction. I hear, from various friends in the Yes movement who've been quite invigorated because people say, yeah, do a referendum next year. And that's right, they should be invigorated. There's nothing wrong with the movement. The people are waiting to be led. You'll never have better circumstances to create the revolution that we need in Scotland right now. Peaceful, democratic, obviously, but a revolution nonetheless. What it requires is that purpose to understand that the job of the Scottish National Party through the years, the other advocates of independence, the other advocates of Scottish Parliament for all that time over the last century has not been the progression of their own careers or their own party, but the achievement of independence and freedom for our country. And that's what we should be doing.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex, and to all of our panellists. Now I'm going to throw open the floor for questions from the audience. Then I'll ask if you can kindly raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and then to give us your name, and then ask your question. Who's going to kick us off? Yes, sir. Your name first.
John Young.
John.
Thank you, everyone. It was great, and in many ways it's my first political meeting. I voted yes in '79 and suffered ever since. How do we take on political cowardice from the other parties? We have other parties well seated in Westminster. How do we change the mood of the rest of that party to go for independence?
Thank you, John. I'm going to put this question to everybody, and because I think those were the words chosen by Eva, I think in the opening remarks, I'm going to start with Eva and I'll go along the panel to answer John's question.
Thank you, Tasmina. We lead by example, that's what we do, and we behave as if we are in the early days of a new and better country, because I believe that's where we are. you've got a chance with Yesterville next month to go to George Square and to demonstrate there that ours is a peaceful revolution, and it's one that we're determined has now already been kick-started. You cannot simply leave it to elected MPs and MSPs to do what they've not done yet, and that is to demonstrate leadership. I think, as Alex said, that the grassroots and the membership of the Yes campaign are in good heart. They and we are raring to go. That's abundantly clear. What's holding us back is something that I referred to earlier as being political cowardice, and that's what I believe it is. I voted SNP last year, I voted SNP this year in the local elections, and I support the SNP as long as their desire for independence remains their raison d'etre. What they ought to be doing right now is listening to the likes of yourself, John, because your view is replicated nationwide. There is a hunger, which is more than a physical hunger. It's an emotional need within the Yes movement to see that our leaders are worthy of that title. So in terms of what grassroots can do, it is put the pressure on the elected members, speak to MPs and tell them just what you thought of Kenny and Neil when they walked out of Westminster, and that you expect that the current SNP MPs will do, as Alex said, use the Parnell book, use the rule book, use it in every possible way and make it very plain to Westminster that actually their days of ruling Scotland are numbered. If you can explain that to SNP representatives in Westminster, that's a good start. But equally well, what has to happen is that MSPs have to understand that they can no longer sit on their hands as this country hungers and freezes, because that is what's happening. MSPs just now, I see, are calling repeatedly on Twitter for Westminster to be recalled when they have not mentioned the prospect of Holyrood being recalled. Now, you tell me what it is about an SNP party in government, in a coalition in effect with the Greens, that enables them over a long summer to sit on their hands, get photo shoots now and again, to wring their hands, to have short summits here and there about what we're going to do about the energy crisis. They can do all of that, but they cannot sit in a parliament and figure out what it is that we have to do right now to create the real circumstances surrounding driving independence forward and addressing the fuel crisis, the poverty crisis, the cost of living crisis that are many people face now and more will face as we go into the winter. So elected representatives need to know that their days are also numbered if they don't, in the words of Gordon Martin yesterday of the RMT, get the finger out. We saw Kenny and Neil in the past few days on the picket lines. I'm not sure whether any other MPs or MSPs have been on the picket lines. Most of them have been conspicuous by their absence. In many respects, the unions are becoming the opposition, and there's something that's not right there when you've got elected politicians that don't have the backbone to support what the unions are doing and are backsliding, pretending that it's somebody else's fault. You've got the Scottish Government in the form of John Swinney saying that he's powerless to resist. He can't enter negotiations between the councils and the unions, etc. And all along this, right throughout this whole charade, you've got a Scottish population watching disaster unfold on a daily basis, whether it's the bin men that are on strike, or issues in relation to the rails, or it's to do with perhaps teachers and nursery teachers going on strike. This is a crisis. This is not a time for people to absent themselves from Holyrood because it's the summer holidays. This is the very time that they should have their sleeves rolled up and be getting down to work. And I hope that that's one message that the SNP government take out of here today, that the Greens are watching too, and they understand that the time for action is not tomorrow or next year, it's today, now.
Thanks, Eva. Dave, how much do you believe, well, I wonder who that is. Somebody's answered your call already, Eva. That's the effect you have on people. Dave, how much do you think political cowardice is a problem, and how helpful is it for those who are relying on people in positions of importance and ability to make change, to declare a love for Westminster?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It was me phoning Eva to help me answer this question. Well, Before I go into the detail of the answer, I read in the National on the 5th of August, I think it was, in Richard Walker's column, that he made a wee, I don't often read his column, but I read it that day, and he said that we had been, and his words were, in a slumber of complacency. And I actually thought that was very interesting coming from him, because he is someone who would not have used language like that even a short time ago. So if he's beginning to realise that we've been in a slumber of complacency, and I presume by we he means Scotland the nation, but I think he means more precisely the Scottish Government, then I think we are beginning, hopefully, to see some kind of movement from these folk. My impression of what's happening in Westminster with our MPs is that there are a number of them who are far more interested, and there's MSPs like this too, in issues other than independence. I think Kirsty from Aberdeen actually said she's hardly mentioned independence in the last year or something. And she's got far more important other issues to deal with. That's really worrying, because these folk are elected by voters out there because they're SNP, and because people know, or think they know, that the SNP stands for independence. So I think they need a shock, and I think the way to give them the shock is through the mobilisation of the Yes movement. We had a march in Inverness last Saturday, where there were about, 2,000 or 3,000 people there. The marches are slowly beginning to move again. There was a lot of enthusiasm from Inverness and from other folk further afield. One guy and his wee daughter came over from Stornoway that morning to go on the march, and then back again that night. So people are beginning to get out and push forward again. And we need to grow that, and we need to keep the pressure on, because that's the only thing I think that will shift them. Because I think they've got into a bit of a rut, and they think they're going forward, but they're not. They're stagnating and they're sitting still. If we don't, as a Yes movement, and I include the SNP in this, I suppose, if we don't take action by, certainly now, but by the time we get to next January and February, when people are really, really beginning to hurt with in the middle of the winter and struggling to pay their bills, and if we don't lead the people to independence at that time, then the far right will lead the people away from us, because the people will be looking for leadership. That leadership has to come from the Scottish Government, because they're the ones that have been elected in government to lead us. And I really, really do hope, and I plead to the Scottish Government and their leader, Nicola Sturgeon, who I've known for many years. She's chopped indoors in Inverness with me, to get a hold of things and move things forward. The referendum next year date is fine, and that has actually helped to boost morale. And we could see it physically in Inverness and Inverness, where people suddenly, with the thought of a referendum coming up, got motivated again, got really wanting to get moving again. Because as human beings, we need targets, don't we? We need something to aim for. You can't just drift aimlessly. So that pressure needs to be ramped up by Alba and by the Yes movement and everyone else, just to push the Scottish Government into doing a bit more than they're doing just now.
Thank you. Hector, do you think political cowardice is a problem for the movement?
I think there's an aspect of cowardice, but I'm just going to say it. I think there's certain politicians have sold us out. They've gotten comfy with their jobs at Westminster, their jobs at Holyrood, and essentially probably their salaries and what's coming off their pensions. But I think we need to change our dialect and how we speak about this, because so often if I speak about oh, the SNP are holding us up, or when I'm speaking on housing, if I mention, oh, the SNP haven't done enough on this, it's straight away, you're a unionist troll, you're slagging the SNP. We shouldn't have to apologise for holding the party of government to account. It should be something of a normal thing. We are the people that they are supposed to be representing. So I think we need to start talking about it as if the Scottish Government need to move faster, more, struggling not to swear here, with more coercive movement. And yeah, I mean, just changing the way we speak, I think people will start agreeing, right, the government, the Scottish Government is who we elect, so yes, we want them to move faster on independence. And certainly this winter, when the energy bills come in, when things start getting bad, and they're going to get bad, people need to realise the Scottish Government can be doing things, but essentially it can be moving us towards independence, which I think everyone in this room would agree independence would make things much better for the winter we're about to come into.
Thanks, Hector. Now, of course, the opposite of cowardice, Alex, is bravery. And you mentioned that the independence movement is in good heart. And I would add that I think the independence movement is brave and has been brave, because in 2014, when everyone else in power seemed to switch the lights off after that result, the movement kept going. It kept marching. It kept doing the events, kept hosting Facebook events, keeping up a social media presence. So I think the movement's brave, but are the politicians brave enough? And how important is it to be brave when you have to face down the opposition?
Well, John's question, but you voted yes in 79, you said, John, yeah. I mean, the reaction to 79 was really interesting. I mean, it wasn't like the reaction to 2014. 79, Scotland went into a political winter. But there was a number of politicians, I mean, I was just a slip of a lad then, obviously, but folk like Jim Sowers and Margaret MacDonald, Alec Neil, recognised that if the SNP changed into, as we put it back in the day, taking sides within Scotland, not just taking Scotland's side, if it clearly identified itself as a social democratic party, if it was trusted in the mainstream of the Scottish political tradition, then it would challenge the Labour Party for supremacy in Scottish politics. And believe me, in 1979 that looked ridiculous. I mean, Labour were a Goliath. They were the 50 MPs, but they became the feeble 50. And we knew that if you pressurised the Labour Party, then you'd get to a parliament. And once you got to the parliament, then of course it would be game on for what happened after that. And that worked. I mean, we knew it would take a generation, more than a generation, Hector, to replace the Labour Party as the dominant party in Scottish politics. But that didn't matter in a sense, because we knew that the Labour Party, and every time when Jim Sowers won Govan in 1988, all of a sudden the Labour Party started talking about a Scottish Parliament again. After a considerable gap, suddenly it became top of their agenda because they wanted to fend off the challenge from the SNP. It was a shock to the solar plexus of the Labour Party. And I regard the Yes Movement and Alba and other parties as a bit like that with the SNP just now. What the SNP was to the Labour Party in the 80s and 90s, now the Yes Movement and Alba are to the SNP. I doubt very much it would have any strategy for independence if it wasn't for the presence of Alba and the Yes Movement's impatience with the lack of action. So sometimes in politics, it's the percussion effect you have, as well as the overall electoral success you have that matters at the end of the day. The other thing I'd say is this. I mean, you were saying, how do you bring other people across into your side? John, they're there already. I mean, the reason that the Tories, with the National Liberals, won 50% of the vote in Scotland in 1955, and by 1997 had no parliamentary seats at all in Scotland, was because they came identified as anti-Scottish. The Tory party became increasingly, looked like an English, indeed a home counties party, of which Margaret Thatcher was the epitome, of course. And as they became more and more identifiably anglicised and less Scottish, their vote disappeared like snow off a dike. And that's what happened to the Labour Party. and particularly after the alliance with the Tories in 2014. I mean, the vow was never delivered, Hector, in the sense that Scotland was delivered what it promised. But the vow undid the Labour Party because the better together, whatever else it may be, was disaster for the Labour Party because it did, and half of the Labour vote who couldn't stomach their party being in alliance with the Tories against Scottish interests. They'd always been sympathetic to the independence case in the first place, defected, and they've never come back to Labour. And they won't come back to Labour as long as there's an independence movement being led. And the last ingredient, I sometimes laugh at people in the SNP saying, well, wait till we get to 60% in the polls and then we'll have a referendum. I launched the referendum campaign, the Edinburgh Agreement, in 2012 when we were at 29% in support. But I knew once you engaged in the argument, we'd build that. See, the last set of people you have to convince are by and large not the people who are still voting for the Conservative and Unionist Party, the rump of the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats or whatever. The people you've got to convince are the people who don't vote. Folk have given up. I mean, I often tell a story, and I'll tell it just once more, because Taz said I could only tell it once more in my life. About when I knew we were in for a real chance in 2014, when I went to Dundee on the 1st of September 2014. Big queue of folk at Desperate Dan, the statue in Dundee. There's this huge, and I thought, it's happy hour. I assumed it was happy hour. I went to the guy at the back of the queue, I says, why are you queuing? And he says, we're queuing to get to vote. I said, no, that's 3 weeks away. He says, no, we're queuing to register to vote. And I said, well, why aren't you on the register if you just moved in to Dundee? He says, no. He said, I haven't been in the register since the poll tax. But this is the first time there's been something worth voting for. That's the people that will take us from the 50% to the 60%. It's the folk who are there, they believe in independence, but they're just no certain whether they're going to be led in that direction, whether they're going to be offered something worth voting for. That's the key to get the 60%.
I was waiting because you've only told half the story, but I'll quote while I'm ahead.
I'll tell the other half later.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Karen. Thank you for coming today, making this effort. It's greatly appreciated. I have two areas I would like the panel to address, and Alex got very close to one of them there. I am concerned, even looking around this room, about the youth vote. What can we do to engage with our future representatives? That's very, very important to me. I am certainly no longer young myself, but I know the youth of today are quite wily, quite educated, quite open. I think they are concerned with world politics at the cost of my independence and their future independence. That's my first point. Okay. My second point is that, probably with everybody else's agreement, my whole life I have listened to other people tell me that we are not strong enough, we are not smart enough, we are not equipped, whatever. There's a very long list. And I think a huge lack of confidence is going to hold us back if we do not address that. I believe, and I would like to know what the panel thinks, that we need to bombard our own people with facts, with figures, to give them the knowledge to withstand all the naysayers and all the people who are trying to take our future from us. I would like to know what the panel feel about the level of confidence Scots have in Scotland's future and how we can change that in the right way, of course. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Well, Hector, you're the youngest person on the panel, apart from Alex, whose year of birth changes every time I hear him speak. So I'm going to start with you about youth. So we're talking about youth and then confidence of the people of Scotland. So are enough people, young people, interested, or what requires to be done to engage them further? Because they were very engaged in 2014. And one point I will, I'm just going to use my position chair for a second, that concerns me, I've said this before at public meetings, about a plebiscite is that a general election plebiscite rules out 16 and 17-year-olds having a right to vote. And when we think about how important their vote was to where we got to in 2014, it is madness to suggest we run any kind of democratic test without the young people of our country being involved in that test. So, Hector, young people.
I think you just mentioned it there. I don't think we need to worry about the young person vote. I think when the vote comes, the young people will turn out to vote. On engaging with them to get involved, I think it's just as Alex has just mentioned, they need a campaign to get behind. They need something to kick off. If you look at the young people that were involved in the summer of 2014, they weren't involved in the winter of 2013. It's that campaign period, and I don't think we need to worry about the young people getting engaged when the time for the campaign comes. I mean, I think there are some young people who continue to be involved in the campaign. I noticed Eloise is here. She's taking photos. She's got a postcard with yes. Things like that. People see. It sends a message that that's what independence is about. It's for the young It's also about the old generation, of course, but it's for the young generation and the future generations to come. So I'm not overly concerned about the youthful involvement. The one thing I am concerned, and I 100% agree with Taz, is this plebiscite idea of ruling 16 and 17-year-olds and EU citizens probably our two biggest categories of yes voters. We're ruling out of having a vote, which is absolute madness in my opinion. On the confidence bit about Scotland, just tell them to stop watching the BBC. Sorry, I'm joking, of course. There's lots of leaflets, lots of yes leaflets out there. I think we just need to start getting them out the doors, start speaking to people about independence, and move over. Actually have confidence in ourselves in speaking about it. I mean, when I first got involved in campaigning for politics, I was nervous of going to doors, but I went with someone who was confident, and I just watched them as they went, and as time went over, my confidence built. So I think when you're speaking to someone, don't be scared you're not going to know the answer. If you don't know the answer, just tell them, oh look, I'll go away and get that information for you and I'll come back to you on it. Take their details down and come back to them with the information. I think they'd respect that a lot more, that you're taking the time to go and find out that information for them than just making up a answer as unionists do on debate shows.
Thanks, Hector. Eva, are young people involved enough, and are the people of Scotland confident enough?
Take your first point first, and it's a fantastic question, thank you. Everybody in this room will remember that the first election to the Scottish Parliament was on the 6th of May 1999. So when you talk about the young folk, they've grown up only knowing devolution. And in particular, those who are now old enough to be voting have grown up in an SNP-ruled country, and they're especially benefiting from various different policies that transformed the Scotland that I grew up in, and for those Alex Salmond and his team are primarily responsible. So I think that we have to put that young people's perspective very much under the microscope, because they're not looking at things from the experience that I'm older than you, that you and I had. I am a child of the Thatcher years insofar as I left school in 1980. So when I went to uni, I was one of half a dozen that were able to do law at Edinburgh because of the student grant system. My brother went to uni after me, and so we had a lot of peers who understood how difficult it was to grow up in the years that, Thatcher, who'd been the milk snatcher. We remember very, very clearly all the events of the 80s in the context of, obviously, strikes and a lack of harmony and discord generally, and a lot of want, and very much the Yoss or Hughes, gives a job, no, that kind of thing. So when you've grown up through that, and you know the impact of all these dreadful policies of the Thatcher years, it's very easy to think that the young folk have never had it so good. But actually, they've never had it so good because of what's happened to them in the last wee while. most of which is now under threat. So I think that's a long roundabout way of saying the youngsters do appreciate the point of independence. They understand up to a point what devolution has done for us. But if you actually engage with folks, say, in their late teens, early 20s, they understand, they believe that independence is a foregone conclusion. They don't really see that there's much of a struggle for it lying ahead. I say that from the knowledge that our son's in his late teens, he's at uni. I've spoken to all these pals about politics, and out of dozens and dozens of them, I found a couple that remain to be convinced and a couple that are dead set against independence. Most of them say, but it's obvious, it's self-evident, it's entirely natural. Why should we not vote for it? Of course we'll vote for it when the time comes. But as Hector says, they need the time to be now. They need the leadership, the drive, the vitality, the urgency of that debate. And then I think the young folk will be there in their droves as they were before. But they need that kickstart that we all need, but they probably need it more than most. In terms of confidence, we can talk statistics till the cows come home in relation to debits and credits and Scotland's potential. The real issue, though, for Scotland, I think, is, as Alex said earlier and others have touched on, the people who have the most to gain from independence are those who are not registered to vote or they don't vote. I live in Clackmannanshire, 25% child poverty in some areas, in others it's going to be as high as 40% at the moment. It's just slightly masked by some areas that are a little more affluent. I cannot understand why I have an SNP-controlled council, an SNP MSP, the Justice Minister, an SNP MP, and yet we're bombarded on a daily basis with GERS figures that are distorted. You see the figures for GERS that talk about Scotland's deficit when Scotland doesn't have a deficit. The reality, and Alec knows this far better than I do, is that Scotland puts far more into the Westminster coffers than we get back out again, in the region of twice as much at times, I'm quite sure. And we also understand completely that GERS measures the Scottish budget on the basis of a Westminster prism, where Westminster's priorities are not ours, where we're allocated Westminster spending that would not be ours, whether it's from blatant examples such as Trident to infrastructure down in the south of England, from which Scotland will gain no benefit whatsoever, but will have the privilege of paying for it. So in terms of confidence, people do need figures, but they need figures that they understand, like how much is your gas bill going to be? How much is your electricity bill going to be? What would it have been had we had a national energy company? Where would we be if we had an oil fund or a wind fund and we hadn't had a reverse wind auction and wind and wave power was coming on shore to Scotland, it wasn't going down to Hull? If the gas that's at Grangemouth was being used in Scotland and wasn't getting sold down south for cheaper prices than we're paying for it up north? So that education is sorely needed, and it's meetings like this and people like yourselves spreading the word which will increase the confidence of the people of this country. We've had generations of Scots being told, too wee, too poor, too stupid. It does eventually sink in, and it's up to all of us to make sure that we overcome that barrier ASAP, because people will die if we don't.
Thanks, Eva. Dave, anything in terms of youth and confidence?
A lot of it.
You exude both, of course.
Indeed. Well, in here I do, right enough, I don't know about the rest of me. But the good old Scottish NHS is keeping me going, really well, and that's something we never want to lose. I don't think we need to worry about the young folks supporting independence, as has already been said, because the vast majority of them, if you do raise the subject with them, it's just really a kind of nod of the head, and I think Eva said, they're presuming it's going to happen. The trouble is with the plebiscite election, then you exclude a whole pile of the 16 and 17-year-olds. So I don't think we need to worry too much about getting the argument over to them. It's about making sure we can get them to vote, and that will make a difference, there's no doubt about that. And once a proper campaign starts, hopefully with a referendum next year, we'll see, then those young folk will get engaged. And if you remember back to 2014, there were big events where it was just young people massive, thousands of them, in halls and really taking part in good debate. So I think most of them are already with us. So it's a matter of making sure they vote. That's the crucial thing, and whatever way we can do that. The people we need to worry about more, and as has been said before, are older folk who are sort of set in their ways, who don't have the confidence, moving on to this confidence issue. And I think it's older folk that don't have confidence in independence. They have confidence in what they've known all their lives. They've got confidence in the wonderful, generous old age pension that they get, not realising it's the worst in the whole of Europe, I believe. They've got confidence in the Plummy-Mouth folk from London and Westminster being able to govern. But these things are beginning to break, aren't they? The whole way that the current crisis is being, it's not being dealt with, it's just being ignored, has got to be getting through to people. And the issue of resources, I remember back in the 70s when we started it's Scotland's oil campaign, one of the big things that was pushed against us at that time was our selfishness and trying to keep the oil just for Scotland. We've got to share it out. And of course, that's what happened. It all went south. There was no sharing up here. I think that kind of attitude is maybe gone, but some older folks still think like that. I'll not mention this person's name, but an old relative of mine, when it was mentioned to her that Boris was planning a canal to ship Scotland's water down to the south, because there's more water in Loch Ness than the whole of England, all the lochs in England and rivers put together, and that's only a part of our water resource. She said, well, we are the United Kingdom after all. And that was the kind of attitude. There's this sort of, well, whatever's going, they trust the Westminster government. Now, there's some of them never going to change. You're wasting your time even beginning to try to change them, especially if they're Daily Mail readers, because they believe the headlines in the Daily Mail, and that's what they base their politics on. But even with them, we've an opportunity, as Alex said, with the resources, the land, the sea, the gas, the oil, the renewables. It is hitting them smack on the nose just now in a way that it's never hit them before. And I think that is our opportunity. The young folk will be soaking it up because they're soon going to be told by their parents, switch off that light, like I was when I was wee. You're not allowed to leave a light on unless you're actually using it. And you had one room in your house heated. We don't want to go back to that. But a lot of folk are going to be forced to be telling their kids. That'll make them even more in favour of Indy. So back to the young folk, we don't need to worry about them. That's a much easier sell because most of them are kind of with us anyway. But we can use this to get the older folk, because we've already as well got a lot of the ones in the middle. And as Alex said too, the ones who aren't currently registered to vote, we need to get them on board as well.
Thank you. Hector, of course, you mentioned, Alex, I'm going to come to you now. The Festival, of course, which is on 18th of September at George Square in Glasgow, which is a celebration of the distance travelled in the time since Indy F1 in 2014 and what we can look forward to. But Alex, do you think, because you're the one that said, as Hector quoted, that people wouldn't go back into the shadows, do you think Scotland is more confident now in herself than she was in 2014? I'm
just devastated that, impressed actually, that David had an electric switch in his boyhood. Given that 40% of the Highlands didn't have electricity until Tom Johnson created the hydroelectric board. I hear we can't create a public electricity company, really? Good job they didn't tell that to Tom Johnson. I mean, the hydroelectric board became SSE and something else. I can't even mind what it's called. I got a note through from OVO. And it's a scandal and disgrace that we ever allowed that to happen. But, the opportunity is there to rebuild it. We've got, as I said, 10 times as much renewables as we could possibly consume as a country. Every one of these £1 billion licences that have been given away by the Scottish Government, incidentally. I conspired for years to get hold of the Crown Estates Commission with the wealth and the foreshores of Scotland to distribute it to the people. I didn't realise we'd finally get hold of it and they would start to give it away to the same characters and crooks that have been taking it for centuries. We have to avoid things like that. I worry about, competence of the government. 2014, there wasn't a question raised about the competence of the Scottish Government. Because, and the people were competent because we knew we were striving to get independence. We wanted to demonstrate to people we could run the show. So, on young people, I think all you have to do is set a time, a day, and a strategy. But if you want people in the barricades, you've got to build the barricades. On confidence, I worry about the competence of government. That needs to get sorted out. Luckily, Westminster's even more incompetent, so there's a relative, confidence gap, if you like. We need to sort out the wind power. I mean, it is the most enormous scandal that a Scottish government would allow, the same, I shall express it, the same. I mean, the guy who's just retiring as the head of Crown Estate Scotland, I mean, he's a forester. For all I know, he's, a great forester. I mean, I'm sure he's an exceptional forester. I'm sure he knew everything you want to know about the Forestry Commission and trees. To actually have somebody like that, dealing with the wolves and sharks of the international energy market, it's a travesty. You have to realise what you're facing to get in. You should have 25% of every offshore wind field should belong to the people. That collateral should be used to create the Scottish Public Company in the model of Tom Johnson's Hydro Board to deliver the benefit. It was electricity for the glens and the hydro benefit for the people. And we can do the same thing again. And then why do we want to have 10 times the electricity we consume? Not to sell it, yeah, of course we can sell it to our neighbours down south, we could do that. But far, far more important is bring energy-intensive industry to the energy. There's lots of energy-intensive industries who are desperate for clean, green power. You bring these industries. That was the Johnson vision. It wasn't just bringing, electricity to the glens. It was bringing industry to the Highlands. And that's what we should do again. If he could do it in 1945, I'm damn sure we can do it in the 21st century. Of course we can. But I like to think, just lastly, the Wee Alba book is a kind of contribution to building confidence. This is what these meetings are about. And the Wee Alba book, we've done 100,000 of them. And hopefully, party chair willing and finances willing, I can help us out on the website. We'll get another 100,000 with even bigger type out in the spring. And you can actually, if you go online, you can make the type bigger incidentally. But that's based on the idea that people don't just want pamphlets and leaflets. They want information. People are no daft. It's the age of information. And even the people that don't read all of the Wee Alba book, they like to know it's there. You'd like to know that somebody's looked at the consequences with the new world we're in since 2014. There's a war in Europe, there's been a pandemic, there's Brexit has happened. You can't pretend it's no happened, like our local member of parliament here. We shall not stand for Brexit. Well, Brexit's happened. You have to adjust to the world post-Brexit and say how we can make things better, how we can re-establish our position in Europe and not pretend we can do it overnight. And that's the questions that the wee Artelian, I didn't mean to be so hard on them. But so the Wee Alba book is our contribution to building that confidence, because even the folk that don't read it like to know that there's a detailed new case for independence available, just in case they find the time to have a look at it.
And I'm going to come to one more question at the back. Just as a mum to 4 young people, I wouldn't be overly concerned that they're not spending a Saturday morning, a public meeting, and talking about independence, basically because young people get their facts from various different other forums that they're comfortable in. So that's not an issue. I often laugh when post these meetings when unionists challenge us and say, well, why are the young people not in the room, making fun of us? But they should respect that young people get their information from other places. But you made another very important point that hasn't actually yet been picked up upon, which is about that the young people get involved in a lot of other campaigns. And I think you're possibly talking about the climate emergency, for example. And I think one of the reasons for that is that there's no fear in getting involved in a campaign like that. Freedom of expression is a concern for people in this country on various topics. And we need to ensure that Scotland creates a safe space that has an ability, a safe ability for people to disagree with people in government on certain issues without worrying about the repercussions for them. And one of the ways that will happen automatically, which is touched on about everybody, is when you actually have a campaign that people feel safe speaking about. So basically, you know, people need to get their finger out and get campaigning for Scottish independence where, you know, it's talked about all of the time and people feel comfortable voicing their opinion in that respect. I think we'll see it on Instagram, TikTok, everything that will happen, and that's where our young people are. Now, there's a question at the back, and we're sort of 10 minutes from the end. Are there any more questions apart from the gentleman who's got his hand up at the back and lady at the front? 3 questions. So I'm going to take them one after the other, and then I'm going to ask our panellists if it's even remotely possible to be succinct in their answers. I hold out little hope if what we've just heard is anything to go by. But we've got 3 questions. So gentle, I'll take them all. So gentle at the back, then the middle, and then lady at the front. Yes.
Thank you. I'll stand up as I can see you from the back there. I'm Ian Stewart from Uig, and it's been my pleasure to be a member of the Scottish Currency Group, an online group for a year or two. It's our belief that you cannot have political independence without financial independence. And what I'd like to know from the panel is, how can you put pressure on the SNP government to ditch its horrendous attachment to the Growth Commission report, which sees us advanced to sterling for 10 years? The only way we can get the nationalisation of the energy production of doubling state pensions is to issue our own currency, and it will be vital in the coming campaign. And I'd like to know what you can do to help.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian. Yourself. Yes.
Okay. I'm Margaret McVicker. I'm from Rossi. I just wanted to raise what your opinion was on, I've been very interested in Salvo and this whole idea that's come up of suspending the union, our MPs, MSP, suspending the union. So, you know, the union is still there, but it's suspended, and on that basis we go ahead with our referendum regardless of what Westminster think.
Thank you very much. Margaret, you said?
Yes,
Margaret. Thank you very much, Margaret. There's a gentleman in the middle. Yes, sir.
Hi there, my name's Hugh. I've got a wee tour business, and just yesterday I had an American gentleman on the tour. He owned a ranch in Colorado, and he was just amused by the amount of water we have. And you mentioned water, and it ran through my head. And he was talking about how his ranch and various neighbours and whatnot, they actually have water fights. He says water is actually more valuable than gold now there. And with what's happening down south, hosepipe bans, all that sort of thing, it ran through my mind. There's over 31,000 freshwater lochs. The gentleman said that Loch Ness is more freshwater than the whole of England and Wales. I think there's actually 3 lochs that qualify for that as well. On that basis, how do you actually articulate that as a real terms value? You could say to somebody, because it's all very well, we've got loads of water, but what does that actually mean in real terms? How would you articulate that so that people can understand it?
Thank you very much indeed, Hugh. I was on a train to come halfway up here yesterday with American tourists who were bemused by the fact that the trains can't even offer water to drink on our trains, because we have so much incredible stuff. I had to apologise on behalf of the people of Scotland to them. Now, 3 questions here. We've got Ian, Margaret, Hugh. Ian's question is, he's a member of the Scottish Currency Group. How can we put pressure on government SNP to ditch an attachment to the Growth Commission report? The second one was about Salvo and the idea of suspending the union. And the third one was about how do you articulate the value of our natural resources, particularly with regard to water. Who'd like to go first?
Can I go first?
Yes, Eva, I was going to come to you because I knew you'd lead the way in succinctness.
Thank you. In relation to the Growth Commission, Scottish Government, SNP, know it's a dead duck. They've been told so often enough. They're going to have to start to listen, and listen they will, to people like yourselves who've done such a huge amount of really valuable work. So all that we can do as a party is to repeat what you've said yourself, that it's abundantly clear we need our own currency, and anybody who says anything different basically doesn't know what they're talking about, is probably guilty of assisting in running a government which is not as competent as it should be. In relation to Margaret's question, Rassie, we were in a wee while ago. It's absolutely gorgeous. I had to go to see Callum's Road, which is what obviously everybody in a way goes there for, but there's an awful lot more to it than that. Apart from the other roads. But then I think, you know, that there's a story there for all of us in relation to Callum's dedication, what he did and why he had to do it, because of what governments or successive governments would not do. And I don't want us to see us back in that territory again, but I think sometimes, unfortunately, we are. In relation to your question about Salvo particularly, Salvo has a part to play. There is no doubt about that. There is obviously great emphasis on the claim of right and the sovereignty of the people. My own view is that Salvo will do what they do best, which is at the moment agitating, raising the profile, and I know that they have a number of events which have taken place and others that are in planning. I think, though, that in terms of driving forward the independence agenda, the Salvo and the claim of right have a part to play, but the bigger part to play is probably that of the elected politicians and civic leaders of the country, because I firmly, absolutely agree that there should be a constitutional convention sitting in Edinburgh every Friday from now until Independence Day, because if that constitutional convention comprises elected politicians who are elected to achieve independence because that's what they support, if it incorporates leaders with class, ability, intelligence and experience, then there would then be a will, a political will and a civic will to deliver independence, and Salvo can be part of that. Finally, in relation to water, water is the new oil. They stole our oil, in effect. It was Scotland's oil, it still is, although you wouldn't know it. Water will be next. It isn't really a joke, actually, that Boris was talking in terms of a canal. There's an awful lot of other people better qualified than me can talk about the theft of water, for example, from Wales, and the Welsh are obviously becoming up in arms again for similar reasons. Would they pipe our water south? You're damn right they would. And all these moves in the background to remove the part of the devolution settlement are all areas where we should be very troubled about what will become of Scotland if A, we are not independent, and B, Holyrood either ceases to exist or the powers it has are stripped away so severely that it may as well not exist, because it will become nothing other than a talking shop. And it's at that time that our resources, including particularly water, of which England will have an increasing need, are going to become ever more jeopardised, and all the more reason for us to get the shoulder behind the wheel and be pursuing independence with all due haste and urgency.
Thank you, Eva. Dave.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. If you actually have a look back at a back edition of the Stornoway Gazette in the 70s, I wrote a letter then about the value of water for Scotland, but nobody took me up on it at that time, so there we are. But water is, yeah, as Eva says, it is the new oil. There's no doubt about it. It's not just for drinking. You can't make anything without water. You need loads of water to make stuff, you know, whether it's engineering or anything else. So we really do have to watch this. My worry is that if we don't take quick action, and we've got to do it in the next wee while, I've been saying for a few years, we really need to act, we really need to act, but we've all been kind of wheezed for Indy, let's not rock the boat too much. We don't want to appear to be divided because the unionists and the media will take advantage of us. The time for that is over. We've got to really push forward. It worries me as well that I saw today that Stephen Noon, who was one of the advisors to the SNP government, and the Yes campaign anyway, back in 2014, has come out with an article or a statement apparently saying that the SNP should change its focus from independence to strengthening devolution. This is basically the unionists trying to play the vow again. They're telling us what we're going to get. Anyone who looks can see that devolution is being undermined, and has been in particular over the last few years with the levelling up money and all the rest of it, this largesse that's coming from London. It's a fraction of what used to come from the EU. It's all our money anyway, because we put it down there before it comes back. But they're playing this game, so I don't know what's happened to Stephen Noon. I believe he now works for Murdoch, so maybe there's a wee hint in there as to why he's come out with what he's come out. Does he really believe it, or does he want to keep a job? I don't know. But it worries me when I see that happening, because it indicates to me that the The undermining, the further undermining is just beginning to ramp up. And I think we can look forward, if that's the right phrase, over the next 6, 7, 8 months to the new year to more and more of this. And we need to actually be gearing up ourselves to be combating it really, really strongly. And things like the currency, I don't think people are as worried now as they maybe might have been back in 2014 about a Scottish currency. I think a lot of folk have come round to the idea, especially people who might have been leading the arguments back then, who weren't pushing hard for a Scottish currency, I think have listened to the arguments of people like Ian and others and now accept that's the best way to go. Indeed, you cannot get back into the EU if you don't have your own currency. Although I would caution the campaign for independence in the widest sense, but in particular the SNP government, against tying in EU membership with independence. That is a huge worry for me, because I know a lot of people who voted to come out of the EU, who are independence supporters and don't want to go back into the EU. They're not a majority, nothing like it, but there's a substantial number of independence supporters who are not keen in the EU. There's a simple way to deal with this. All you do is you say, we will initially go into EFTA and the EEA, and it might take a few months or whatever. It won't take nearly as long as getting back into the EU anyway. And then we have a referendum of the Scottish people on a deal that the EU will offer us to go back in. And I think they'll be really keen for Scotland to go back in. And I think we could strike a good deal. But you put it to the people, and the people can decide, do they stick with EFTA and the EEA, which gives you lots of the benefits without a lot of the negatives, or do you want to go back as full members? And the Scottish people decide after Indy. If it is tied in as an absolute, I think we will lose votes, and maybe 5% of the votes will be enough to lose us the referendum. So we need to be really careful.
Thank you, Dave. Hector, any comments on any of the three questions?
I think on the Growth Commission and currency and how we change the SNP policies on this, we can't. It's got to be SNP members. The party's constitution, I believe, says that their policies have to go through conference, so it's got to be party members that change the policy on that. We know it's hard for SNP members to get stuff like this onto the agenda, but I think we need to look at how Alex was talking about disrupting Westminster. SNP members go and disrupt conference. There's ways and means of doing it, as Chris McElhinney incidentally showed with his plan B and stepping up in conference, which now, as we know, is SNP policy, but he was booed off then. But
Indeed.
you know, that wasn't on the agenda, but he found a way of getting it onto the agenda by standing up at the start of it. So there are ways of bringing this to the agenda, but like I say, there's not much the Alba party can do on changing that. It's got to be SNP members that change it at conference. On Salvo, I think Salvo can play a big part in our independence. Not sure what way it goes, but it can be part of a tactic, I would say. Yeah, I think Salvo with a convention can seriously put pressure onto Westminster to crumble to a referendum. And if it had the backing of the Scottish Government, with Salvo, with a convention, that's a lot of pressure to be putting onto Westminster. Water, I think it's another Scottish asset that we should be promoting, but again, we should be saying to our government not to let it be stolen by the Westminster Government, which is evidently going to happen, as is happening with our renewable energy.
Thank you, Hector. And finally, Alex, I'm going to ask you, and use this as an opportunity for your round-up remarks. I was going to give everyone closing remarks, but they've taken far too much time. They're not getting them.
Serves you all right. Right. Well, firstly, Ian, the argument for sticking with sterling finished the day that Brexit happened. The argument, the economic argument for for staying with sterling for a time or a long time finished, because no Scottish government will want to pursue the anti-European policy that the Westminster government is pursuing. The two economies will diverge, thank God, incidentally. And David's quite right. I mean, the sensible move is to EFTA and to the single market and the EEA, and he's also right in the political tactics of it. But there'll be an engagement, a re-engagement with Europe will be a consequence of independence, and the two economies, the Scottish economy and the rest of the UK economy, will diverge, and therefore you shouldn't have the same currency. We'd also be much favoured now from a clean break settlement. You know, we don't, the settlement you want to negotiate is no assets, no liabilities. None of the, no sterling, no Bank of England reserves, but none of the liabilities either. You know, a zero-sum game would be by far the best negotiated settlement. That's a strong negotiating position, incidentally. Very strong. I mean, it reverses the George Osborne tactic of 2014. So, yeah, I mean, the greatest English economist in history, John Maynard Keynes, once said, when the facts change, I change my mind. The facts have changed. And the biggest fact that's changed is Brexit. The second point that Margaret made about Salvo, I don't think, you know, it's a particular claim of right that we should be looking for. It's not the 1689 claim of right or the claim of right for the 1980s. It's the thread through Scottish history of popular sovereignty that represented. That sovereignty belongs to the people of Scotland. And that goes back far beyond 1689. I mean, that goes back to the Declaration of Arbroath. And that's the constitutional thread that we should hold and appeal to. So you don't have to replicate the estates of Scotland. That sovereignty lies in the elected members of the Scottish Parliament and from Scotland at Westminster. They encompass the sovereignty of the Scottish people by the democratic mandate they've been given. What they have to do is use it. They have to use it by setting up a convention. They go to the Royal High School every Friday. You don't even have to abstain from Westminster. You have to encompass that sovereignty and make the declarations you need to be part of the campaign that forces Westminster into an agreement. You know, it's not a particular document we should get our inspiration from. It's the belief and the principle of popular sovereignty, of the sovereignty of the people. I mean, that was one of the ingredients of the American Declaration of Independence. So I think it might be who knew, and the revolutionaries knew the debt they owed to Scotland. That's why there's a Tartan Day in April the 6th in America at the present moment. And that is the belief from Scottish history we should encompass in part of our political tactics. And finally, Hugh and water, you know, I'll tell you, I don't think it's going to be difficult. I mean, I was sitting in Barcelona last week when this map was shown that I referred to earlier, and they showed a satellite image from 10 years ago, in late August. They showed from last year and from this year of the continent of Europe. And 10 years ago, most of it was green. Last year, a lot of the continent was brown, but, you know, British Isles, let's call them that, were pretty green. This year, the green starts at Yorkshire. People have always known the importance of water, incidentally. I mean, that great revolutionary, what's his name, Charles Grey of Strathclyde Regional Council, organised a water referendum in the 1980s to help keep it out of the hands of Margaret Thatcher and her pals. But now, above all, people understand the importance of it as a natural resource. And not just a natural resource for Scotland, and again, a natural resource that attracts industry and water-using industries to our country, not just to supply our people with a public company, but something we can, you know, we can help the world with. You don't shut them bottled water, but the expertise and the knowledge of water engineers in Scotland has been unsurpassed. And the fact that that's run by a public company would be of enormous help in international aid, as opposed to some of the characters who are involved in the private companies in water aid internationally at the present moment. It's people with no axe to grind. There's something you want to give and help with. I mean, for example, back in 2011, in the big freeze, you might remember that Northern Irish water system broke down. Why? Because they built their pipes just a few inches below the surface, because Northern Ireland hasn't used to big freezes. So they didn't sink them as far as they've been sunk in Scotland, and therefore were subject to a dramatic failure of the entire water system. What I can tell you is the English private water companies were all humming and hawing, examining the fine print in the contract. Should they, what were they obliged to send in the way of water to Northern Ireland? And I just said, after Paisley and McGuinness had phoned me, I said, send it, give them it, now. Because we ran a public company with a public obligation for our people and to help other people as well. So it's a magnificent argument. I don't think we need to worry about the people understanding it. I just think we have to articulate it. Like so much else of this case at the present moment, I think the people are willing. It's the leadership that's required.
Now, I'm shortly going to pass over chair to Hector because there's some other elements to this morning into this afternoon's event. But before doing so, I'm going to ask that you kindly join me in thanking our speakers. But I'd also like to thank you all for coming and attending today's meeting and hopefully taking away your wee Alba book. I mean, at a time when faith in politicians is at an all-time low, I'd say this: I fundamentally believe that the power to win independence rests with ordinary people in Scotland. Because at the end of the day, regardless of the fantastic arguments you've heard from this panel, and you will hear, I hope, in the weeks and months to come as the campaign, I hope, steps up a few gears, at the end of the day, people go to people who they know and who they trust to ask the questions. And you have the power to persuade those in your circle to follow you in your belief that independence is the best way forward for this country. So those in powers may be shirking their responsibilities, but ultimate power lies with us, and let us not let anyone take that away from us and feel the strength of that power within you to articulate the argument. Now, I hope there are more books available. I hope the folk on Sky aren't selfish and are just giving out one copy to them. I mean, it wouldn't be happening in Glasgow. You'd get 5 or 6 to take away with you. So Hector, prove me wrong and show me that you give lots of these great people in the audience. You can hand them out to people who you know. As Alex said, they don't have to read the whole thing, but at least they have to understand that the work and effort has gone in to making the case, and they can come to it as and when it suits them. So be generous with your books, Hector. And with that, I'm going to ask you please to thank the panel: Hector Macleod, Dave Thompson, Eva Comrie, and of course Alex Salmond.
Can we have a vote of thanks for our chair, Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh?
And with that, I'm going to pass over to Hector, who will now take over.
Have we got the... So we've got, at the back, we've got a bottle of Isla Razi gin, which we're going to ask Taz and Alex to sign, if that's okay. A bottle of Isla Sky whiskey, a bottle of the conference edition, which is one of the first editions of the Wee Alba book, and it's got the details of today's event. We'll ask all the panel to sign it, so it'll be the only memorabilia Wee Alba book of today's event.
Pass up here, Matt. Yeah, do you want to put it on the front so people can see it? I think I was supposed to be wearing bikinis and holding placards and stuff.